Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keisha Pollock Porter, and I'm the Dean of the Bloomberg School, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you for the annual Michael Klag and Lucy Meoni lecture, which is now in its second year. We are so fortunate to welcome Dr. Peter Hotez as our guest in this prestigious series. As you know, Dr. Hotez is a leading expert in global health, pediatrics, and vaccines, topics that are always timely, but seem to grow more urgent every single day. You'll hear more about Dr. Hotez in just a moment, but first I'd like to share a few brief words about how this event came to be. This lectureship was created in honor of Mike Klag and Lucy Meoni. For anyone who is new to the Bloomberg School, Mike and Lucy are a couple who have had a long history here at the school. Mike served as dean for 12 years, from 2005 to 2017. He led the school through a transformative era that featured major technological shifts in learning, tremendous growth in faculty, and new partnerships worldwide. And he also hired me. I started as assistant professor in that time. And Lucy is a proud alumna of the Bloomberg School who served on faculty here as well as at the School of Medicine. During Mike's time as dean, he was a passionate advocate for our school and helped build strong relationships with our supporters. And this lectureship was created through the efforts of the school's department chairs. They spearheaded the creation of this event through their planning and generosity with support from other faculty, staff, and friends. This lecture is a continuation of Mike and Lucy's impact and a testament to how much they mean to our community. Mike and Lucy are very sorry not to be with us today due to a late scheduling change. Mike is currently in Tokyo presenting a report to the Global Burden of Disease Study, and he sends his regrets. But we do have a video, and Mike and Lucy wanted to share a few words in their absence. So let's take a moment and listen to them right now. Let's hit play.
Hello, everyone. Lucy and I are so sorry that we're not able to be there with you in person today. This lectureship is so very special to us. We are incredibly honored to have it named after us, and we deeply regret not being there. There was an unavoidable conflict that arose after the meeting was scheduled. But this year is especially meaningful because of the speaker, Dr. Peter Hotez. He's been such a strong voice for science, rational thought, and policy making, public discourse. More personally, he has been a strong advocate for children on the autism spectrum and their parents. And as you may know, Lucy and I have a daughter, Sarah, on the spectrum. So his work in that area has been personally very impactful for us. So we're sorry to not be there and wish you a great event. And we look forward to seeing it on video, hopefully. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Well, we're grateful for Mike and Lucy, and we thank them for sharing that video. And again, a welcome to you. So I want to, once again, just thank you all for being here in honor of Mike and Lucy and all they continue to do for our school and public health. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Judd Walson, the Robert E. Black Chair in International Health, to welcome our speaker.
Wonderful. Well, in preparing to introduce Dr. Hotez today, I realized something really important, which is that as you get more and more accomplished, you have to give shorter and shorter lectures because the introductions take so long. So as I was preparing this, I just realized I could spend 20 minutes introducing Peter, but I will try to keep it relatively short. This is particularly rewarding for me because I also got to know Peter very early on in my career when I was just starting out my first couple years. And he's been an incredible mentor, friend, and he's somebody who I think has really taught me the value of looking out for people that you're sort of mentoring. And he's always kind of had his eyes out on the horizon for opportunities for me. And I really deeply appreciate that. I also want to say that he's partly responsible for me being here. He was one of the first people I called when I was discussing the chair position here, and he was really instrumental in helping think through that. So thanks. I'm really honored to welcome Dr. Hotez. He's a professor and the founding dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He's known as a dynamic communicator and an advocate for global health, vaccinology, neglected tropical disease control, and autism. And he's led national efforts to defend vaccination in this moment, particularly, and to combat anti-science rhetoric. He's also known for, during the COVID pandemic, leading a team that designed a low-cost, patent-free COVID-19 vaccine that reached over 100 million people in India and Indonesia, for which he was recognized with the Hamburg Award in Biomedical Science, the National Academy of Medicine, and was also nominated for a Nobel Prize, along with his partner, Maria Elena Batazzi. He's also been instrumental in the development of a number of vaccines, including the first hookworm anemia vaccine, which is currently in trials in Brazil and Gabon. And in addition to hookworm and COVID, has also worked on vaccines for schistosomiasis, Chagas disease, leishmaniasis, and SARS. He's a very prolific author, as many of you may know, with more than 700 scientific articles, multiple books, including Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, My Journey as a Vaccine Scientist, Pediatrician, and Autism Dad, and The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, both published by Hopkins Press. His most recent book, Science Under Siege, How to Fight the 5 Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World, published with Michael Mann as a co-author, was just published this year. I won't go through the very extensive long list of awards that he's been awarded with, some of which I mentioned, but he's been recognized for his contributions to science and to science communication with a number of awards. He earned his MD from Cornell Medical College and a PhD in biochemistry from as well, and holds the Texas Children's Hospital Endowed Chair in Tropical Pediatrics, co-directs the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development, previously was the president of the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, and was the founding editor-in-chief of PLOS Neglected Tropical Diseases, which I was fortunate to succeed him as. He's also co-director of Parasites Without Borders, a global nonprofit with a focus on those suffering from parasitic diseases in subtropical environments. So as you can hear, quite accomplished across a range of science, communication, and a number of different areas. So we're really pleased to have you here, Dr. Hotez, and please come up and welcome.
And they gave me a nice step stool here. But it's like to be tall. How cool. I don't think I want to go back. Thank you for that. Both incredible introductions. And, you know, Johns Hopkins has been always such an inspirational place for me, and so many of my biomedical heroes have worked here or still work here. And I was thrilled to see Judd, your predecessor, Robert Black here, who's also one of my mentors and a source of inspiration. And to have 3 Johns Hopkins public health deans here is really special. I almost see if we maybe could hold a seance, see if we could bring back DA, and because I think he'd enjoy hearing this as well, who is of course also an important mentor for me. What I'm going to do, and Judd, congratulations on everything you're doing, and it's so exciting to watch you develop this department, and it's not lost on me. This is not an easy time to be doing these kinds of things. The only thing harder, I would imagine, would be being a dean of a public health school right now, and just to let you know that you're earning points in heaven every day that you stay in this job, and thank you for doing that. I'm going to start here, and it's sort of a funny way to start. I won't start right in talking about autism, but actually here, it's because it's actually one of the most common, going on all the cable news channels all the time. This is actually one of the most common questions that I was asked. Literally, the question was, "Hey doc, what the heck is going on?" That's the question. And you say, okay, well, what do you really mean by that? And you kind of tease it out, and then you start to realize, why have we been seeing this, uptick in this regular cadence of pandemic infectious disease threats? That was not something that was on the radar screen for me beforehand. And indeed, in this new century, it started out with severe acute respiratory syndrome and the original SARS in 2002 that came out of southern China, hit Toronto, then H1N1, then our second coronavirus, Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, then Ebola hit West Africa, and there were actually Ebola cases in Dallas, and I got involved with Governor Rick Perry's task force when Ebola hit Dallas. Then we had Zika in 2016, which came to South Texas, then Ebola again, of course, that horrific epidemic in the eastern half of the Democratic Republic of Congo, then SARS-2, COVID-19, and H5N1 last year, and many of us are predicting another third major SARS-CoV virus before the end of this decade. And those are the better known ones. What's also happening a little bit below the radar screen is this big rise in tropical infectious disease, especially vector-borne disease, happening both in Texas and the Gulf Coast, where I am, and a similar phenomenon in Southern Europe. So a sharp uptick in dengue and chikungunya and Zika virus infection. On the right there is not my map. This is from Simon Hay at the Institute for Health Metrics, a predictive map of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, which is an urbanized mosquito that transmits dengue, chikungunya, Zika, and yellow fever. Malaria now in South Texas, South Florida, malaria in Greece and Italy coming back, leishmaniasis now in Texas, and of course, hookworm infection. So what the heck is going on? And the answer is, the short answer is we don't know. The more interesting answer is the clue may be from Hippocrates, who, when you actually read, I can't read Greek or ancient Greek, but the English translation, it's interesting how much he talks about climate and the directions of wind, southern wind versus northern wind. And I think he was onto something. And indeed, Patrick Manson picked up on writing about Hippocrates when he wrote the first tropical disease textbook. So I think climate is clearly having a big impact. And in teaming up with Michael Mann, the climate scientist, he's the one that taught me about the hockey stick. And if you look at think of the global temperatures on our planet, the shape of a hockey stick with the blade. The last 200 years, we've seen this steep rise in global temperatures after a bit of a dip. So that dip was, some people call it the Little Ice Age. If you ever look at pictures of Washington crossing the Delaware or Bruegel paintings, we had that Little Ice Age. And now this sharp rise of unprecedented temperatures due, of course, to greenhouse gases and fossil fuel burning, so much so that Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, doesn't even call it global warming anymore. He just calls it global boiling. And you certainly feel that when you're down in where I am in Houston. You take a walk in the morning. Mosquito season now starts around February and goes all the way to the end of the year, which was new. And of course, that may help explain the rise of dengue and Zika and chikungunya and West Nile virus infection down in Texas and the Gulf Coast. But maybe less well obvious is, what does that have to do with something like a coronavirus or Ebola? And of course, a lot of that was work done here at Johns Hopkins to show that bats are animal reservoir hosts for those viruses. And with the altered temperatures and rainfall patterns, you're starting to see bats now seek out new migratory patterns and come into closer contact with people, which I think is an important element of that. But it's not only just the people coming closer to the bats coming closer to the people, it's the people coming closer to the bats. And we've seen now this explosion of megacities of more than 10 million people. So for the first time on our planet, starting around 10 years ago, more people live in urban environments and rural environments, and it's not symmetric growth. We've had, for hundreds of years, our megacities were Tokyo, New York, and London, and now a lot of that asymmetric growth is happening in the megacities in low and middle income countries, in Mumbai and Delhi and Calcutta in India, and you know this better than anyone, in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and Kinshasa in DR Congo, and Lagos and Luanda, and the list goes on. So the estimate is there's going to be 41 new megacities by the end of this decade. So the kind of apocalyptic vision of the world is coalescing into these hot and sweltering megacities
I think that's Lagos on the left and Sao Paulo on the right. And this is what we're going to have to be contending with when we think about pandemic threats. And we know a little bit about hot and sweltering megacities in Texas. We've got at least 3 or 4 of them now, and they have explosive growth. Often that urban growth is outpacing our infrastructure for clean water and sanitation and safe environments. On the left there is, we also are the home of NASA in Houston. That's a satellite photo flying over Texas with our Texas Triangle, which accounts for 2/3 of the population of Texas. So that's Houston at the bottom right there, Dallas, Fort Worth at the top, and then at the left is San Antonio and Dallas. And I think these areas are going to be particularly vulnerable for all of those infectious diseases that I've been talking about, especially the vector-borne illnesses, where we're already seeing a big rise. And now we're doing this very interesting metagenomics project. So this was not my idea. It was the brainchild of Ed Holmes at the University of Sydney in Australia. I'm sure many of you worked with. He did this very interesting study where he did the complete genome of 2,500 mosquitoes with the Chinese genome centers across China and found all sorts of new arboviruses as a consequence. And what's nice about it, because right now what we do in Harris County, where Houston is, the mosquito control division traps mosquitoes and they collect pools and they have to know what they're looking for to design PCR primers. With this metagenomics approach, it's agnostic, so you can just get the full genome of the mosquito and the mosquito tells you what's there. And we're doing this now for our tick populations, our triatamine kissing bugs. We now have the return of typhus in Houston and Galveston because of fleas. And so we're doing the flea population. So we really want a complete flora and fauna of all of the infectious diseases rising there. And this is where I am in the Texas Medical Center. I'm sure many of you have visited this. I actually took those pictures from my cell phone camera. If you take a Southwest Airlines flight and fly into Hobby Airport, it often goes right over the medical center. It's, we do everything big in Texas. I've been there 15 years. It's the world's largest medical center. It's even bigger than this. It's got 120,000 employees, 60 institutions, including the MD Anderson Cancer Center and Texas Children's Hospital and Baylor. It's actually by itself, it's the 8th largest business district in the country. It's got more building space in downtown Los Angeles. And it's an incredible place to work. And 15 years ago, came there with the idea that we really could use a school of tropical medicine there and also create this vaccine center. And the idea behind the vaccine center was we were doing a really good job with the Gavi Alliance, and that Ruth Caron and others have been involved with here. And a lot of that business model is the big vaccine producers, Merck Company, Sanofi, GlaxoSmithKline, Novartis, now Moderna and Pfizer, have done a very reasonable job of a multi-tiered pricing model where they'll sell the vaccines at full freight for North American countries and Western Europe, and then tiered pricing for the Gavi Alliance. And that has worked incredibly well. And you can't argue with success when you look at some of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation numbers in terms of the decline of under 5 childhood deaths over the last 20 plus years since the start of the Gavi Alliance from measles and pertussis and Hib meningitis is extraordinary. But certain vaccines are falling through the cracks, and those were vaccines for diseases that only occur in low and middle income countries. And for that, the big vaccine players were less interested in. So that was the idea, to kind of start making the vaccines that no one else would make, like for hookworm anemia and schistosomiasis. We have a malaria vaccine and a Chagas vaccine. And then around 15 years ago, we got approached by a group at the New York Blood Center, Shibu Jiang and Lanying Du, who came to me and said, hey, Peter, just like nobody cares about your parasitic disease vaccines, no one cares about our coronavirus vaccines for SARS and MERS. And would you work with us? And how could we turn on that opportunity? So we did, and we began making low-cost versions of SARS and MERS vaccines. And that allowed us to hit the ground running. It was fortuitous because when the COVID-19 sequence came online in bioRxiv in January 2020, we were able to pivot and make that as well. And our model, I use the word business model kind of in quotations or with an asterisk because it's not a conventional business model. We try to work with the vaccine producers that band together and call themselves the DCVMN, the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network. They're represented by the orange and blue dots. And one of the most common, and they meet once a year, and many of them are on the Asian continent, the African continent, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. And one of the most common technologies they make is many of them make their own recombinant protein hepatitis B vaccine that you got as kids or you gave to your kids. And this technology has been around for a few decades. It's involved in it uses microbial fermentation in yeast, so either baker's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or methanol utilizing yeast such as Insenula or Pichia. And then if you ever visit one of these factories that's making it, it almost looks like a trip to the brewery because it's a big bioreactor. It's fermentation technology. And what's nice about it is there's no limit to the amount you can produce. It tends to be fairly inexpensive. So the antigen component is often the least expensive component of the vaccine. It's the adjuvants can be the priciest component. As I say, no limit to the amount you can produce. The proteins are very stable, so they often require just simple refrigeration, no deep freezer requirement. You have no need for animal or human cells. So in the sense, you can do this as a vegan technology, which comes in very handy. And parents trust it because they've already vaccinated their kids against hepatitis B. So that's the model that we adopted, at least initially, that we would make the production cell bank in our labs at Texas Children's Hospital for these vaccines and literally send it via World Courier to the vaccine producer in the LMIC, and then we would work with them on the scale up. We would do it at the 5, 10, 20 liter fermentation scale in our lab, and then work with them on the 1,000 liter fermentation scale. So the technology transfer process is more of a problem in fermentation technology and chemical engineering. And we would try to do this minimizing patents and strings attached to see how we can make this happen. So, here, for instance, is some of our signature vaccines for hookworm and malaria and schistosomiasis. And I'm not going to go into the biology today, but just to show you the maps of where these diseases are. So on the right is where hookworm and malaria overlap, or they combine to cause severe anemia in the green. And then on the left, hookworm and schistosomiasis. And the point is, imagine being the chief executive officer of a biotech or a pharma company. This is probably not the map you want in your business plan, right? Because where's the financial return? It's the financial return is in US and Canada, North America, or Western European countries, or UK and Japan. So what is the business model? And I think this is one of the things that we struggle with almost as much as the science, is trying to really understand how that works. And so this is one of our signature vaccines for see if I can here it is. For hookworm infection. And for those of you who don't remember what a hookworm looks like, this is some hookworms shown in endoscopy by a colleague of mine at the Asian Institute of Gastroenterology in Hyderabad, who has a lot of patients with hookworms in their intestines. And that pool of blood is the hookworm is injecting an anticoagulant, which we found is a factor 10A inhibitor, a small peptide inhibiting factor 10A. And then it sucks up the blood, and the blood courses through the alimentary canal of the worm because the worm is interested in hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is the nutrient source for the worm, like malaria parasites. And they have a similar cascade of enzymes involved in hemoglobin digestion. And so that's our target. So back a long time ago in the 1980s, I was an MD PhD student at Rockefeller and Cornell, and worked with my principal investigator, Anthony Cerami, in Theobald Smith, that's Theobald Smith Hall, many of you will recognize that name, to look at the idea that you could identify the proteins that the hookworm uses to degrade hemoglobin, and then you could induce an antibody response to it. Then the antibody would be taken up by the worm, and the antibody would localize to the worm like a Trojan horse and interfere with its ability to feed on blood. And so that was my quest for decades. And I had come here over the years to talk about the biochemistry of hookworm and molecular biology. And we had worked out this entire cascade of enzymatic degradation and it turned out is very similar to what malaria parasites do. Now, Plasmodium, those doing it from inside the red cell, hookworms from the outside. These enzymes, in the case of hookworm, are bound to the brush border membrane of the gut of the hookworm, probably by putative GPI anchor sequences that we identified. And they do a cascade of enzymes using an aspartic protease, a cysteine protease, a metalloprotease. And then they have to do something about the heme moiety. So any animal that feeds on blood really does not like heme, because heme has iron in it and it generates toxic oxygen radicals that peroxidate lipid membranes, damage DNA. So in the malaria parasite, what they do is they have two mechanisms to deal with the heme. One, they polymerize it into an inert pigment known as hemozoin, which is a pigment that's black in color. If you ever do an autopsy on someone with malaria, their spleen and liver is chock full of that black pigment. But they also have a specially modified glutathione S transferase that's less involved in transferring glutathione, and it has a special heme binding pocket that sucks up heme. And it turns out hookworms have that as well. And what we did was we tested all of these enzymes as recombinant proteins in laboratory animals, injecting them, inducing the antibody response, seeing what was the best vaccine. And of all of our candidates, it was the GST that was overwhelmingly the best. And Toyina Sojo solved the X-ray crystal structure of it, demonstrated the heme binding pocket. And then we were, supported by the Gates Foundation to do, and then the European Union and the Dutch government to do it, to create this consortium known as HookVac with a number of European institutions, do a series of phase 1 and phase 2 trials. And it was looking fine. It was immunogenic, it was safe. And then we were getting stuck. And here's where the investment business model comes. We kind of got into this funny catch-22 situation going to the phase 3 trial, because the phase 3 trial is going to be the most expensive component of it. If you remember, for instance, with the 2 mRNA vaccines for COVID, the 44,000 person Pfizer study, 60,000 person Moderna study, which I'm sure a number of you were involved with, those were very expensive trials, right? Tens of millions of dollars. And it worked because you had Operation Warp Speed. We have no Operation Warp Speed for a hookworm vaccine. And so we got into this interesting problem where we'll call them our investors, which were basically various foundations, said, Peter, we don't really want to invest in a hookworm vaccine to see if your vaccine works. And when I say we, this is our Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development. That's co-headed by myself and Mary Elena Battazzi. But we don't want to invest all that money to see if a hookworm vaccine works, ... unless we already know it works. So what the heck do you do with that? And so we said, well, we have a recommendation. This should be pretty straightforward. Develop a human challenge model, infect human volunteers with hookworm larvae, and show that your vaccine protects them. And that will de-risk the investment. And it should take you a few months to set up. Well, we did it, although it took 8 years to do it under an IND with the FDA. And this was the work of David Demert and Jeff Bethany. And we were together at George Washington University previously. They remained there after I moved to Texas and put a huge amount of work in to really work out, to standardize the model, to infect human volunteers with 50 hookworm larvae. The larvae go through the skin. They then get into the afferent circulation to the right side of the heart, and then the lungs. Break out of pulmonary capillaries, go to the alveoli, up the respiratory tree, the bronchioles, bronchi, trachea, cross over the epiglottis and swallowed. After they're swallowed, they become an adult hookworm to establish in the gut. That's when the eosinophilia starts, when the adult worms start invading the tissues. And then they mate and produce eggs. And so you use quantitative fecal egg counts as your surrogate for the number of worms. And then we tested the vaccine, and David released the results last year. And it was just incredible what happened. So this is the control here. This is the recombinant protein on alum. These are quantitative egg counts. And this is the recombinant protein on alum together with a CpG oligonucleotide. We got close to 100% protective immunity. And we've been working with Ruth Karen to advise us on the next steps of this. And it correlated with antibody. And it reduced the eosinophilia as well. So presumably, as the worm is becoming an adult worm, starts scaling up production of this enzyme, the antibodies come in and neutralize it. So it's really an amazing story. The problem is, now what? Because even though we've reduced the risk of the investment, you still need the investment. And And so and I'll talk in a second about our low-cost COVID vaccine. So we went back to the vaccine producers that made our COVID vaccine, Biological E in India and Biopharma in Indonesia. And the difference, of course, was the deal with those manufacturers. So as we make it, we show it works. The Indian government, the Indonesian government for COVID was prepared to guarantee the advance purchase of 300 million doses or more because it was COVID. And everyone understood the emergency. But what do you do for something like a debilitating chronic neglected tropical disease like hookworm? It's still on the table, but this is one of the things we're struggling with, whether we can combine it with a malaria vaccine to get it across the finish line and having those discussions with the World Health Organization. With COVID, it was a little more straightforward. These are numbers from Alison Galvani's group with Megan Fitzpatrick at the University of Maryland, who estimates that mRNA COVID vaccines, despite what our friend Mr. Kennedy likes to tell us, mRNA COVID vaccines saved 3.2 million American lives. So instead of 1.2 million Americans dying from COVID, it would have been 4.4 million and averted 18 million hospitalizations. The problem with it was getting that technology to filter to low and middle income countries. So, as any engineer will tell you, when you're trying to accelerate a brand new technology, there's a learning curve before you can get from 0 to the 20 billion doses required. And so what happened was predicted and predictable. Enough doses were made to be bought up by North American countries and European countries. And this left the African countries and South Asia and Southeast Asia out in the cold. So this is a bubble map by the middle of 2021, when we had all been vaccinated, of where people were not getting vaccinated. The bigger the bubble, the lower the immunization rates. And it's all the usual suspects: the African continent, India and Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia. And the Institute for Health Metrics showed pretty much that correlated with death. So if you look at where the big bubbles are, it's also the darkest country on the COVID death map in 2021. So this virus was racing through unvaccinated populations on the African continent, Southeast Asia, and India. And we were getting frantic phone calls. Could we help? And that's what we did. We sent our production cell bank to India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Botswana. We did due diligence to make sure they knew what they were doing. And India went the furthest. They used this vaccine, which they call Core B-Vax, because it's named after the company Biological E. And this became the primary immunization for 75 million adolescents. So as proof of concept that you don't have to be a big pharma company to still do big things in the vaccine space. There are not a lot of examples of that. Menafrivac, I guess, for meningococcal A would be another example. But I think they're instructive lessons to look at. So briefly, to tell that story, this is what my life looked like in early 2020, doing the tech transfer. And if you've ever, so once we would send the production cell bank literally via World Courier to these places, then you have to work with them on their scale up. And if you've ever worked with those Asian countries, as many of you had, you want to get to them by close of business their time. What time are you waking up in the morning? Yeah, 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning. And at that time, I was going late into the night talking to Don Lemon on CNN and Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC. So I didn't sleep for 3 years, but we were able to do this. The other problem we had was funding, because we were cut out of Operation Warp Speed, because they didn't think we had the chops to do this, because we were in an academic health center. And this was one of the blessings of Texas. You can raise money. So we got money from the Clayburgh Foundation, which is the King Ranch in South Texas, the MD Anderson Foundation, the Dunn Foundation, a lot of oil and gas money. Tito's Vodka, based in Austin, Texas, gave us $2 million. Not that I'm advocating for alcohol consumption, but should you have a vodka-containing cocktail this weekend, you don't want the Russian stuff anyway, right? You want Tito's Vodka, based in Austin, Texas. And so it wasn't billions, but it was $8 or $9 million that let us do this. And then we transferred the ownership to them, the idea that we really do want to decolonize the vaccine ecosystem. So after that, it's up to them to work out with their own national regulatory authority. In India, their FDA equivalent is called the DCGI, how to do this, how to do the data sharing, how to do the clinical trials, how to work with WHO for pre-qualification. And they showed the level of virus neutralizing antibody right away was as good as mRNA vaccines and much better than inactivated virus vaccines or adenovirus vaccines. So we had completed this by early 2022. And that was really gratifying to see that of a vaccine that we made in our laboratory. Indonesia was a similar story, but they wanted a different name. They called it Indovac, slightly different construct. The interesting twist on Indonesia was when we told them it was a vegan technology, their ears perked up. So they came into our lab, inspected our notebooks, and confirmed that every reagent that we used came from a non-animal, non-human source. And then they went back to their clergy because Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country, and it's got certified as halal. I think it was the first halal COVID vaccine. So as you're going to scale, stuff starts to happen that you never would have imagined. And so that was good to be able to do that. But I am concerned what we're seeing now, and this is what I want to end on, this kind of stalling in global immunization rates. So a couple of years ago, the WHO sounded the alarm that all the progress in the last 20 plus years with the Gavi Alliance was starting to stall in terms of global immunization rates. The same in the US with a terrible measles epidemic that started in my state of Texas, West Texas, landed 100 kids in the hospital, and 2 kids died because their parents refused to vaccinate them, otherwise school-age kid. That's a picture of me in the monk painting over there. So what to do? So this is kind of an interesting part of my life that Judd had mentioned. Part of my life was very deliberate and strategic. I wanted to be an MD, PhD, pediatrician scientist making vaccines, and went to Rockefeller and Cornell on the Upper East Side of New York, began working on a hookworm anemia vaccine for my MD, PhD student. Now, 40 years later, it seems to be working. But John Lennon says life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. So among them is, as a MD, PhD student, I met Ann. We lived at Rockefeller University housing for $44 a month. Those days are long past, I guess. And then we had 4 adult kids, including Emily, who's actually an assistant professor now at UCLA, just got her K Award funded. She works at the Autism Center because she was inspired by her sister, my other daughter, Rachel, who's our daughter with autism and intellectual disabilities. And that was the unplanned part. And the other unplanned part was a number of years ago, I was in my office and my assistant says, "Hey, Dr. Hotez, I've got these 2 gentlemen on the phone," and she's reading it. One is named Dr. Anthony Fauci, and the other one is named Dr. Francis Collins. Can you speak to them? And I said, "Yeah, I think so." And I said, "Okay." So the phone on the other end, Peter, they're both on speakerphone. "Peter, we got a job for you. You're a vaccine scientist. You have a daughter with autism. You can explain why vaccines don't cause autism. We're going to have you talk to Bobby Kennedy. And you're going to do a series of calls and Zooms with them, and we're going to have it mediated by a third person who was Tim Shriver from the Special Olympics. And Tim was great, but Bobby was problematic. And that year of discussions that I'll tell you more about in a minute led me to write the book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, because it required me to look up everything I could to kind of debunk his claims, and it wound up making me an expert of sort in this area. As I've watched, and it also gave me a front row seat to watch how this anti-vaccine movement has evolved or devolved over time. And this is how I'll finish, kind of quickly taking you through the different iterations of the anti-vaccine movement. It's not that one is switched to the other, they've been sort of added on. So the original claim, vaccines causing autism, which of course started with the Wakefield paper in 1998. That's been around now for 25 years. And then around 10 years ago, it became politicized under this libertarian banner of health freedom, medical freedom. And now with version 3.0, the third converging thread is a very corrupt wellness and influencer industry. So let me take you through those 3 things. So let's go through number 1 first, vaccines causing autism. Even within that, whatever metaphor you want to use, there's a series of moving goalposts or whack-a-mole. In other words, an anti-vaccine group makes an assertion about a certain vaccine. You spend a lot of time, the scientific community does, debunking it, showing it's not true, and then they just switch it up and change it. So it becomes this exhausting exercise. So it started with the MMR vaccine, the Wakefield paper, which was shown to be fraudulent. It was withdrawn by the editors of The Lancet, but also associated with large cohort studies showing that maybe by some of the people here in this audience, showing that kids who get the MMR vaccine, and the allegation was it was a live virus vaccine that was replicating in the colon, and at the time it was causing what they called pervasive developmental disorder. Now we call it autism. Large cohort studies showing that kids who got the MMR were no more likely to acquire autism than kids who didn't. And other cohort studies showing kids on the autism spectrum were no more likely to have gotten MMR than kids not on the autism spectrum. And that should have been the end of it. So that started in 1998. Then 2005, this is when Mr. Kennedy came on the scene, and he wrote an article in that well-known biomedical journal called Rolling Stone that, okay, it's not MMR, it must be the thimerosal preservative that used to be in vaccine. It was published simultaneously in Salon magazine. Didn't really make sense to me either. And again, the response was big cohort study showing kids who got vaccines with thimerosal were no more likely to acquire autism than kids who didn't. There were even pregnant non-human primate studies that were done showing no link. That should have been the end of it. Then we had Jenny McCarthy and Jim Carrey start parading around in green t-shirts, if you remember that. And they said the problem was not the MMR thimerosal, it was spacing vaccines too close together. That's overwhelming the immune system, and we have to green our vaccine ecosystem. It was all BS. And then it was alum vaccines, and it was HPV vaccine for cervical cancer and other cancers said was causing infertility or autoimmunity. And now the latest is something so vague that no one can really figure out what the heck they're talking about. And that's deliberate because they can make it up what it is when they wake up in the morning. And it's something called chronic illness. So this is Rachel, and she's a little girl. That's me with Rachel now. Mr. Kennedy comes out and says that people on the autism spectrum can't use the toilet, and they don't work, they don't contribute to society. These are all quotes. They don't pay taxes. And Rachel has a verbal IQ in the 80-90 range, functional IQ in the 40 range. She can't live independently, but she walks to Goodwill industry in our neighborhood and makes money, loves getting her paycheck and paying taxes, and has friends and goes to the movies and has a very interesting life. And wrote the book that details the evidence showing there's no link between vaccines and autism, as I just went through. But even that wasn't enough, because the parents looking at this would say, and fair enough, rightly so, okay, doc, I get it now, vaccines don't cause autism. Hey, doc, what causes autism? Very fair question, right? And so this caused me to really look into the genetics of autism. In 2020, the Broad Institute at Harvard MIT published a list of more than 100 autism genes, all involved in early fetal brain development in the prefrontal cortex. Many of them, all of them are involved in neuronal connections, many of them neuronal cytoskeleton genes, which makes a lot of sense. We did genomic sequencing on Rachel and my wife Ann and I with Baylor Genetics, found Rachel's autism gene, which was a little different from the ones in the Broad, but it was still a neuronal cytoskeleton gene, similar class. But it doesn't mean that there's no environmental trigger, because there are about half a dozen chemical exposures that can interact with autism genes. And the best described one we have is Depakote, or valproic acid, an anti-seizure medication, which is why obstetricians don't want you to be on Depakote if you're pregnant or think you might become pregnant. That's been shown to interact with autism genes and result in an autism phenotype. And in my discussions with Mr. Kennedy, I said, Bobby, I can identify 4 or 5 chemical exposures. Tylenol was not one of them. That looks really good. And he said, hey man, you're an environmental attorney. You're interested in autism. This is your moment. This is your sweet spot. You should be all over this. And he couldn't care less. He had less than zero interest, which was a source of frustration for me when he comes out a few months ago and claims that the community of autism scientists are saying it's all due to shifting diagnostic criteria. And I do think that's a big component of it. I'll give you an example. So we used to say it was 10-to-1 boys to girls. Now it's more like 3-to-1, because we've gotten better at diagnosing autism in girls and women, because they can camouflage it better. Their comorbidities get diagnosed, such as OCD or some of the teenage girls with eating disorder on the autism spectrum. It's probably going to become closer to parity. which is my way of saying to Bobby, well, it's going to go up again. But again, that's an example of shifting diagnostic criteria. And the American Academy of Pediatrics started mandating mandatory autism screening in the early 2000s. But I said, don't tell me that the scientific community is saying there's no environmental link. That's just not true. I went through it, chemical by chemical with you, and you were the one who had no interest. And then he pulls this stunt at the White House 2 weeks ago and makes this kind of inexplicable laser focus on Tylenol when that was never very high up on anybody's list as far as I know. And there was a large study of 2 million people by the Karolinska Institute in Sweden 2 years ago, 2 million people showing no link. Now there's a meta-analysis, a systematic review. And guess what the meta-analysis systematic review shows? Like all meta-analysis systematic reviews, some studies show an association, others don't. So yes, it'd be very reasonable to say, well, maybe that's something we should look into more. And if the president had said, look, we're concerned about autism, we want to look into this more, we're going to convene the best autism genetics experts and neuroscientists and bioinformatics people and environmental health to help us try to weigh the balance of the autism genes versus environmental exposure, identify what the gaps are, and see what more work needs to be done. That would be very reasonable to do, but that's not what they did. They made that big pivot towards Tylenol and then leucovorin, which I'll talk about in a minute. In the meantime, after the paper was published, there was very nice work by Sergio Pasca's group at Stanford, now with brain assembloids, brain organoids using neurons with autism genes, and they can show aberrant migratory patterns. So it's really a very complete description. In the meantime, the scientific community, the anti-vaccine activists didn't want to put all their eggs in the autism basket, and they switched it up in a way that I wouldn't have predicted. And this happened starting around 2014, 2015, and it was in response to an action by the California legislature. So like a lot of trends in the US, it started in California and amplified in Texas. And this is a map of anti-vaccine sentiment in the state of California, because especially in Orange County in California, up in Marin County, parents were so concerned about autism that they were withholding vaccinations from their kids required for school attendance. And then in 2014, 2015, you started to see breakthrough epidemics. And the first one is usually measles, because measles has that, that's that high reproductive number, and that's often the first one that you see. So there was a large measles epidemic in Southern California in 2014, 2015, and the California legislature responded, I think, appropriately. They shut down vaccine exemptions. They said, from now on, you want to send your kids to school, your kids have to be vaccinated. And I supported that. And it solved the measles problem, but it produced a backlash, particularly in certain states like my state of Texas, where under this banner of health freedom, medical freedom, anti-vaccine groups started getting PAC money, political action committee money. And here's where it became a political movement. And here's where it gets really hard to talk about, because we don't like to talk about politics, right? I mean, all of our training says you're not supposed to talk about Republicans and Democrats and liberals or conservatives or red states and blue states, red being Republican, blue being Democrat, because we have to be politically neutral. And it's not that we're pushing that, they pushed it. And now we have to figure out how to respond. So you started to see anti-vaccine groups getting PAC money in my state of Texas from Empower Texans and other under this banner of health freedom, medical freedom. You can't tell us what to do about our kids. And we began seeing this rise in parents opting their kids out of vaccines, and over 100,000. And this doesn't even talk about the homeschooled kids. We have, by some estimates, 700,000 homeschooled kids in our state of Texas. Anybody want to guess the percentage of homeschooled kids who are not getting their vaccines in the state of Texas? Want to throw out a number, percentage? 20, 40? Yeah, it's a trick question. We don't know they're homeschooled, so it's probably a lot, right? But it's probably a lot. So, but it's probably over 100,000 kids, and that's what came off the rails during COVID-19. And This is an article I wrote for PLOS called The Great Texas COVID Tragedy. It looks at all of the deaths in Texas because people refused COVID vaccines. I'll take you through this. The shape of the curve will look familiar to you. But this is for Texas. These are daily deaths on the y-axis. These are dates, 2020, 2021, 2022. So here's the original lineage wave. Here's the alpha wave in the winter of 2021. Here's the delta wave in the last half of 2021. Here's the BA1 Omicron wave. And this big green arrow is when vaccines became freely and widely available, probably even a little earlier. By the early spring 2021, any Texan who wanted to get an mRNA COVID vaccine could. But you see that as many Texans died after the green arrow as before the green arrow. And that's because so many Texans refused to take a COVID vaccine. So of the 100,000 deaths, 40,000 needless deaths. So this anti-vaccine activism is a killing force in Texas, around 200,000 deaths nationally. And when you look at where people are dying because they're refusing COVID vaccines, it's not across all of the states. So in the cities of the Texas Triangle, the urban areas, pretty good vaccination rates, higher than average for the rest of the country. Same in South Texas, but you can get into these rural conservative areas of West Texas, Panhandle. By the way, where did our measles epidemic begin this year? Same place, so hold that thought. But that's where so when you go into those areas or in rural Piney Woods, East Texas, you talk to people. And when you talk to people, everyone you talk to has lost a loved one because they refused a COVID vaccine. And that's when you understand the magnitude. Now, this has been looked at by Charles Gaba. And as I say, it's not fun to talk about politics, but Charles Gaba is a health analyst for ACA signups, but it's been reproduced by Axios, National Public Radio, probably groups here. It's been reproduced by the New York Times and looks at those first three waves of COVID by political leanings. So the original lineage that came in 2020, the alpha wave winter of 2021, and the delta wave. So the original lineage, when it came in from southern Spain into New York and Massachusetts, well, just so happens those are Democratic states. And so that's why it looks blue. But look what happened after COVID vaccines became available after this in the Delta wave. It's all red states. And the redder the county, the higher percentage of Republican voters, the lower the immunization rate and higher the death rate. So much so that David Leonhardt of the New York Times just called it red COVID. So what happened here? I think what happened in the politics was in their zeal to push back against vaccine mandates, which I kind of understood, not necessarily I agree with, but I understood it. They unfortunately went the next measure and falsely discredited the effectiveness and safety of vaccines. So we saw this at the CPAC Conference of Conservatives in Dallas in July 2021 that kicked it off. You had Representative Matthew Cawthorn of North Carolina say, well, first they're going to vaccinate you, and then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles and this kind of stuff. And you roll your eyes and okay, I get it. But that was not what disturbed me the most. What disturbed me the most was they then paraded out all the most toxic anti-vaccine activists to say the vaccines don't work and they're not safe. And then the pylon came. You had Fox News anchors every night during the Delta wave. And this is documented by two groups, Media Matters for America and a research group out of the Federal University of Science and Technology in Zurich, where Einstein studied, document every night during that Delta wave. Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity, the most widely watched opinion news broadcasters in the country, 3 million viewers a night, filled their broadcasts with these anti-vaccine talking heads, discrediting the effectiveness and safety of vaccines. And then the pylon came. You had Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin hold these phony baloney vaccine injury roundtables, or Rand Paul, Marjorie Taylor Greene, called people like me medical brown shirts, comparing vaccines to the Holocaust. So it became this whole kind of ecosystem. So, if you're watching Fox News every night or watching Joe Rogan podcast, Joe Rogan did this pivot where he then really pushed hydroxychloroquine, discredited vaccines. You went down that rabbit hole and you made an executive decision not to vaccinate yourself or your family, and you paid for it with your life. And so the way I think of this is these individuals were victims. They were victims of not misinformation or infodemic, and that wasn't just random junk out there in the internet. It was an organized political movement. And now you're seeing this spill over into childhood immunization. So this was from a Gallup poll last year around this time, asking the question, do you think vaccines are more dangerous than diseases they're designed to prevent or not? And there's a clear partisan divide there, same red-blue partisan divide. NBC News has now just released this, that finds 77% of US counties have seen vaccination rates decline. And 2 weeks ago, the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Washington Post, did that same kind of political change. And it's clear that there's that same partisan divide in who feels comfortable vaccinating their kids and who doesn't. And it's very hard to figure out how to walk back. And so you had, the Florida Surgeon General, our friend Dr. Ladapo, Harvard Medical School trained, gets up there and says, well, mRNA COVID vaccines, you don't want to give them because they're contaminated with DNA that's inserting next to our oncogenes to cause turbo cancers, right? That's the statement. And it sounds very sciencey, doesn't it? Until you realize that, first of all, there's no such thing as a turbo cancer. That's a made-up term. And then second, the mRNA lipid nanoparticle, sure, it may have some contaminating DNA nucleic acid in it. Fair enough. But the lipid nanoparticle gets that nucleic acid package past the cell membrane into the cytoplasm. It doesn't get into the nucleus because for that you need electroporation. That's why we have no licensed DNA vaccines. And even if some were to get into the nucleus, we have interferon-inducible proteins of our innate immune system that block integration of foreign DNA into our genome. Otherwise, every time we eat a hamburger, we'd have cow DNA in our genome. But here's the problem. I'll go on MSNBC and CNN and explain that. But going on MSNBC and CNN, I'm not reaching the people I need to because they're kind of insulated and walled off. And unfortunately, that walling off explains why we have this huge measles epidemic in our southern Great Plains in West Texas, spilling over to New Mexico, 4-state measles epidemic, 100 hospitalizations, 2 needless deaths. And if you're looking, there's a similar phenomenon going on now in southern Alberta, which has become kind of the Canada's version of Texas. And there's a large measles epidemic there moving south. So I think this is where you're really going to start seeing childhood infectious diseases break through. But even that's not all, because now folded in is version 3.0, the wellness and supplements industry. And it's big business. Some analysis suggests it's a $500 billion industry, not as big as the big pharma companies, which is a $1.7 trillion, but getting up there. And what's their business model? Their business model is you buy up what you can in bulk, you repackage it, put your own label on it, and sell it with a telehealth visit and charge $1,600. That's the business model. So have you ever wondered why they're all anti-parasitic drugs? Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, fenbendazole. It's because there's a bucket of it, and you can buy it up cheap, buy it generically, jack up the price, sell it with a telehealth, $1,600 telehealth visit. Or you've got things like this stuff. They claim the mRNA is producing COVID spike protein for years, and that's what's damaging us, even though the plasma resonance studies suggest they're only producing it for a few hours, which is probably why we get that short durability protection. But that doesn't stop them from selling spike detox pills, whatever's in that. And so now when you listen carefully to Mr. Kennedy, he's even changed his rhetoric to accommodate the health and wellness industry. So, during our measles epidemic, well, you can either get the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, or you have an alternative. The alternative is a cocktail of budesonide and vitamin A and clarithromycin. And I say, where the heck does that come from? Well, there was a dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health who pioneered the use of vitamin A and as a high dose therapeutic. But that's very different. What Kennedy is talking about and others is as a substitute for the MMR vaccine to replace it as a preventative. It's absolute nonsense. And so this is my view, the MAHA movement. It's basically an economic stimulus plan for a very corrupt health and wellness and influencer industry. And that may have something to do with leucovorin. Why? Because it's available generically. The minute I heard that, I said, guess what? Health and wellness influencers are going to be offering now. it may have some benefit. If you look at the subsets of people with different autism genes, some of those genes are associated with a rise in autoantibodies, some against some anti-nuclear antibodies, some antibodies against sphingomyelin, others against cell surface receptor, like the folate receptor. I don't know if that's a cause or just a sideshow. And it may be that leucovorin has some benefit for those, but not to, these very sort of baby talk solutions. We're going to find the cause of autism, Tylenol. We're going to find the cure for autism, leucovorin. Who talks like that? We don't talk like that. I mean, it's like talking about cancer, right? I mean, everyone knows cancer is a complex interplay of oncogenes and environmental triggers. Nobody would say, in the right mind, would say, we're going to now in September announce the cure for cancer, the cause of cancer. It's kind of this simplistic baby talk that's very damaging. And unfortunately now it's spilling over globally. So we're starting to see that same anti-vaccine activism now pop up on the African continent. And it's that same US style for anti-vaccine activism. I'm sure many of you follow the work of Heidi Larson, who's a fantastic medical anthropologist at London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine. And she's run the Vaccine Confidence Project for years and has really done a granular look at the kinds of anti-vaccine activism around the world. And I love her work, and I'd see her at conferences or on Zoom calls, and we would talk, and we never quite understood each other because the way I was talking about the US anti-vaccine activism around the health and wellness and supplement industry, around this libertarian politics, was so different from what she would describe, whether it was in France or Pakistan. Now we're starting to see more of a convergence. So with the Alternative for Deutschland political party in Germany, or Marine Le Pen, you're starting to see that same kind of language. Now, even though I don't consider myself a political figure, that's not the way they see it. And part of the health and wellness and influencer industry is not only to attack the science, but to attack the scientists. They have to, because it's not enough to discredit the vaccines, you have to discredit the scientists talking about it. These are some of the nicer pictures of me here. When Steve Bannon calls you a criminal, that's pretty serious stuff. I mean, talk about authoritative sources here. This guy here, and then the emails come in, the stalking. That's why we have to have this fantastic Johns Hopkins security here, which I'm so grateful for. But this guy here puts it on the subject line here. He goes, "Doctor," not that I want to shock you, but just to give you a flavor for what some of these emails are like. "Doctor, I use that term loosely, Hotez," because they don't want to say I'm a doctor. "You print one more paper or blog suggesting the roundup of free citizens," which of course I don't, but it's again the health freedom, medical freedom stuff, "to get an unproven, untested shot that's no more a vaccine than an M&M is," which is ridiculous. "And I'll suggest to my patriot friends that you be hunted." The idea of the army of patriots coming to hunt me down. And then, of course, they've got us planning these pandemics for financial reasons, when of course they're the ones who are profiting. So they call them plandemics, right? So I did this, I built the COVID virus in an underground lab at Davos at the World Economic Forum with George Soros, of course, and I didn't even get invited to Davos, but you get, and so you'll see this pervade the literature, whether any new pandemic. So this is one of the reasons we have to be concerned now. It's really going to block pandemic preparedness, because everything's a plandemic, everything's a plot. And the other thing is, I learned they don't like the Jews very much. I'm the trifecta. I'm a scientist, a vaccine scientist, and a Jewish vaccine scientist. And you see this, I'm planning this with Soros, another psychopathic schizophrenic Jew, the Jew death jabs. These are the swastikas that get sent to my house on a number of occasions. And I've actually gotten interested in, I've written a couple of papers on, because there was a history to this. So for instance, in Weimar, Germany, Einstein's theory of relativity was called the Jewish fraud in Weimar, Germany, because it wasn't immediately easily verifiable, as opposed to more muscular Aryan experimental physics, or what Freud would say about in psychoanalysis, that was called another Jewish fraud. So I've been kind of doing these interesting historical links between anti-science and anti-Semitism. It's not complete overlap, but I think there's some pieces to this. And obviously, during the Black Death in the 1300s, the Jews were accused of poisoning the wells and were kicked out of various European cities, in some cases horrible pogroms. There's one interesting analysis that looked at the towns and cities in the Rhine Valley and elsewhere in medieval Germany and Central Europe, where they kicked out the Jews and where they didn't. And the ones that didn't kick out the Jews had a faster economic recovery after the Black Death. Kind of an interesting paper. So I think that's it. This is the new book where I've teamed up with Michael Mann, the climate scientist, and we got intrigued because we started comparing the attacks on climate science and biomedical science. And he reached out to me. There was this horrible pile-on with Joe Rogan and Elon Musk and Bobby Kennedy demanding that I debate him on the Joe Rogan show, which I didn't want to do. I didn't want to help his presidential candidacy, and said it would send the wrong message of how we do science. But he reached out to me and said, hey, been there, done that, because the attacks on climate science kind of predate the attacks on biomedical science by a decade. And so this just came out, really released 2 weeks ago. And really kind of details this whole very sordid ecosystem. And the top line of the book is, our planet faces two big existential threats, both of which you're working on here. Maybe you should rename it the Bloomberg School of Existential Threats. Pandemics and the climate crisis. And of course, the two go hand in hand. But now there's a third leg to the tripod, and that is this whole anti-science ecosystem that's blocking our ability to respond to it. So I'll stop there. Happy to answer questions. Thank you so much for having me. It's thrilled to be here. Thank you.
So I think we have, Brandon's got a microphone. So if you want to just raise hands.
And also, if you're shy, you can always email me. As I like to say, the anti-vaxxers have my email, so you can have it too. It's just Hotez, last name at BCM, stands for Baylor College of Medicine.edu. Just put in the subject line, you're part of this, because you can imagine what the inbox looks like. Yeah.
Peter, thanks very much.
Hi.
This in your talk, but I wondered if you could address it more directly. How do you break out of the bubble? How do you reach the audience that we're not reaching through CNN, MSNBC, regular?
Yeah, no, it's one of the most important questions. How do you break out of that bubble? And, I was going on Fox News at the beginning of the pandemic. I was going on Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity. And then when the White House came out, saying everyone take hydroxychloroquine, I couldn't go along with it, and I disputed it. And then the invitations to Fox News stopped. Actually, the evening invitation stopped. Bill Hemmer in the afternoon hung in there with me a bit until they started attacking me outright. Then that was it. And that was a loss, because obviously those are the people, we needed to reach. And, and I emailed Joe Rogan to say, bring me back on, let's have a discussion. But it's tough, and people tie their political identity, and of course, having the wellness influencers just pile on and portraying you as a public enemy or cartoon villain, it makes it even tougher. So I think it's a very long, I don't know the answer to your answer about how do you break through. I mean, working with representatives in Congress and the Senate on the Republican side, I think that helps. I mean, I've had a number of conversations with Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, who's chair of the Help Committee, trying to do it through that way. And in private, most of the Republican senators and congressmen, there's no issue. It's only a handful, but publicly for them to refute it makes it problematic. They don't want to get primaried out in their next election. So also a very complicated issue.
Maybe I'll go to one online, then we'll come back. Oh, sorry. We'll go to one online, then we'll come back here. Just a question that, there are some sources, such as the recent book In COVID's Wake, which do bring out a number of criticisms of the response to the pandemic. How do we acknowledge those limitations and move on and prepare for the next pandemic?
Yeah, so this is really important. I haven't read the book, although I got sent a copy. I haven't read it. It's from the Princeton University, right? It's really interesting. I can't tell you how many countless Zoom calls I've been on around trust in science and medicine. And it always starts out people wringing their hands, our colleagues, what did we do wrong? And I pushed back on that a little bit. I said, yes, the communication wasn't perfect. And I can actually cite chapter and verse because I was there of things the CDC could have said in a different way. That's better. But you know what the truth is? Overall, the communication wasn't that terrible. That's my view. That's the high level view, with some exceptions. But what it really was the bad actors weaponizing this, right? On Fox News every night. We'll have herd immunity by April, the whole Great Barrington nonsense. I mean, and attacks on the scientists. So the real reason, so without having read the book, just reading the blurbs on the back and things, I was sort of not happy because this is revisionist history. It's making it sound like we screwed up. And yes, we made mistakes, as we always will during the middle of a pandemic, but it wasn't that terrible. But not adequately saying this was an ecosystem, this was bad actors that weaponized it and deliberately forced people to attack the scientists. I mean, look, we had our current NIH director on Fox News, right? He would get up there on Fox News and say, sure, Hotez is in a secret cabal with Fauci. He has funding from the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. You're like, what the hell? Your whole microbiology department at Stanford is funded by NIH. I was so disingenuous, and it was that over and over again. So it was a deliberate effort to attack mainstream science, and you're still hearing it, right? This statement that you hear constantly now from the Health and Human Services agencies. Now we're going to apply gold standard science, right? How many times have we heard that's it's BS, right? I mean, we've always applied gold standard science. What they really mean is they want to apply gold standard pseudoscience, and they want to gaslight you. This is all gaslighting to make it sound like what they're bringing to the table is something new and very special. And it is very special, but in a very dark way.
Dr. Hotez, I've been a huge fan of yours. I've been following you on social media for a really long time. I'm a cancer researcher, and it's one thing when you have people in the lay public or Fox News hosts, spreading all of this misinformation. It's been very disheartening at the recent ACIP, for example, to see fellow cancer researchers and fellow scientists spreading the turbo cancer myth. What do you say to those people? How do we combat that? Because they should know better.
Well, the other thing I've noticed now is they'll start out with an anti-science viewpoint in one area, whether it's COVID origins or climate science or vaccines. And then eventually they buy the whole farm. So eventually it becomes universal. And so if there's some way you could kind of keep them in their lane and not to spill over, but it's really frustrating. And I understand academic freedom, and I'm the beneficiary of a lot of academic freedom, but there's something else that I think we don't pay enough attention to, and that is, we also have something at our universities called professionalism and ethics. And where's the professionalism and ethics of that? And that's what, now that I'm a dean of sorts, having, I'm part of the problem now is how do we call out our colleagues, not so much for academic freedom, but professionalism and ethics? And of course, they'll weaponize it and saying you're tramping on their academic. I mean, how many times have we heard the Fox News talking heads reaching 3 million viewers every night that they're censored? I should be so censored, right? But there you are.
Maybe one.
Peter, I have a question for you. You've painted a really dark picture of where we are. Where do you find hope?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first of all, I do think it's important to maintain optimism and find those rivers of light through the darkness. I think one of the things that before I answer that part, let me just say one other thing to bring us to make things a little darker. Always darkest before the dawn. And that one of the things I don't like is when some of the heads of our academic health centers kind of say to young people, oh, you know what, this will pass. Just hunker down for a couple of years. And don't raise your head, just stay quiet and this thing will blow over. And I don't like that. I think, because I don't think it's true. I think, it feels like a different country from the one I grew up in. And so I don't think it's hunker down. I think it's lean in, but lean in productive ways. And so the key is to be very strategic. First of all, recognize that there's a good chance we will see significant cuts from the government to science, both through the NIH and NSF. And even though we seem to have gotten away with it this year, who knows what'll happen in the out years. So there will be government cuts to science, but there's still things we can do. And I don't mean moving to France. I mean, that you can do that too, and that's not so bad. But I do think that we can still shape a very important scientific enterprise, but it's going to have to be more involved in the business sector to the private sector. We're going to have to get better at working in the biotech sector, understanding how those models operates in terms of venture capital and private equity, and taking the time to learn some of that. So you will be able to do the science you want, but you're going to have to be more deliberate and more strategic about how to do it. It's not going to be as easy. It never was easy, right? Science was never easy, but you can't just fall into something. You're really going to have to want it and be very thoughtful and strategic. The other thing I say is, especially if you have a doctoral degree, whether it's an MD or PhD, remember that your doctoral degree is more than just the content of your dissertation, right? You may not realize until later on in life, but you've been given an incredible skill set in terms of data management and critical thinking and data presentation and all of the things that you've been picking up, project management. So you have an incredible skill set. And you're actually far more powerful than you think, but you're going to have to be very strategic in how you do it. And I think that's going to be an important message. So, there was this really, I can't, as a Yale man, I can't believe I'm saying this, but they're a Yale person, but there was a pretty good article in Harvard Magazine. And they interviewed 3 professors, Doug Melton, the brilliant developmental biologist, Stuart Schreiber, the chemical biologist, and Michael Minna, who's more of you will know as an epidemiologist. And they all had to leave Harvard because they were starting innovative technology companies. And they are all frustrated by the fact that they couldn't bring their graduate students and postdocs along with them because they're doing really cool stuff. And now Harvard is thinking about maybe inviting them back in some capacity. And I think that may, so it could be that the Johns Hopkins professor of the future will have a foot in biotech and a foot in venture capital and private equity and a foot in an academic lab and finding mechanisms to have greater fluidity through those different sectors. Again, it's kind of thinking out loud, but I think, it's one of the things you write about in the book is doomism is not a help either, right? Just to throw up your hand and say we're doomed. There are things we can do, but we're going to have to be much more open-minded, I think, than we were in the past. And so I wrote that for PLOS Biology a couple of months ago for the PhD side, even going as far as to say for your PhD in biosciences, maybe you should be rotating through a biotech or private equity and learning some of that. And I thought I was going to get a lot of blowback. So far, not so much. There is one weakness, though, in the paper, but the reviewers didn't pick up. And I didn't really think about it until I thought about it one night after the paper was published. If the government cuts to science are prolonged or sustained, and you only rely on the private sector, eventually the pipeline of innovation dries up too, and then the whole thing does fall apart. But at least for a while, I think there are things we can do.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you so much.
Thank you
for coming.
Thank you.
Since I have the microphone, I do want to make a plug that the authors of In COVID Wake will be coming here on November 6th. Check your email for details. There's a Hopkins and American Enterprise Institute co-hosted event. So hope to see you there. But I want to stop for a minute and just thank Peter Hotez. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. And I think Peter can stay for a few minutes up here if people have additional questions. And thank you all for coming.
Okay, body language in the room.
Peter, I just want to say thank you again
Thank
for
you.
being here. So
Thank
appreciate
you.
your
You're the best.
time. Oh, thank you.
Good luck with
Thank
good
you.
luck with everything.
Well, thank you.
You know, I can do it. You have such an important role now. I think I can really help.
Thank you. Here. Thank you.
Thank you.